Welcome to Excel for Educators Episode 7. My name is Alicia Parker, and I'll be your host. In this video, I'll be demonstrating how to take data from either two spreadsheets or two tabs on the same spreadsheet and combine them into one spreadsheet or tab. I'll be doing this on a Windows 10 computer using Excel 2016. If you're on a different operating system or a slightly older version of Excel, much of this should look the same for you. All right, so let's get started. This is a data set of fake student data that probably looks like something you might use in a school or district. It is not uncommon for educators to have one spreadsheet that is a list of their students, like a roster or class list, and another sheet that is a list of their students' scores on a test, but they'd like them combined into one spreadsheet. I see people doing this by hand all the time. A teacher has a roster on one Excel file, and then in another file has test scores for the students, and they painstakingly combine them by hand. This video will teach you a much faster way, and doing it with this method will help avoid errors. You can easily combine two sets of data as long as they both have a common identifier. A column of first names and another column of last names will not serve as a good common identifier, and you'll see why shortly. Ideally, both sets of data should have a unique student ID. If not, you can create a unique ID by concatenating the first and last name. I have a separate video, it's episode 4, on how to concatenate. However, if you have two students with the same name, like John Smith, you'll run into a problem combining the data because the identifier, which in this case is the name, is the same for two people. So it's best to use unique student IDs whenever possible. On this spreadsheet, there are two tabs of data. The first one is a list of student IDs, student names, and then two columns of state test score data. Let's pretend this is an algebra exam given by the state. There's a scale score and an achievement level ranging from 1 to 5 for each student based on their algebra exam performance. The second tab mimics a datasheet that you might have with some basic information about students. This could be a single teacher's roster or a whole school of students and teachers. So imagine this is the data you have on your students, and then the state test score data comes in, and you want to have it all on one sheet. I've got both data sets on one sheet here, but what I'm about to show you works if you have the data in two separate Excel workbooks as well. The key to merging these two tabs is a unique identifier. In my data set, I have an SID, which stands for Student ID. Both tabs have the student ID. So I'll be able to connect the data based on that. As I said earlier, if you don't have a unique student ID, you can create one by concatenating first and last names, but beware of the issue of students with the same name. I'm going to use the formula called VLOOKUP. The VLOOKUP requires 4 pieces of information in order to work. I want to start on the tab that is the roster or class list, and I'm going to add a new column labeled State Test Score. In the very first record, which is row 2, I'll start my formula. Every Excel formula starts with an equal sign, and then the command, which in our case is VLOOKUP. After the equal sign and the formula command, you always put an open parentheses. This is pretty standard in any Excel formula. The next thing you need is the lookup value. In our case, this is the unique ID. So I'll click on A2 because I want to look up the ID for this student in my other sheet and find this student's test score. Notice that if I click up here in my formula bar, Excel is telling me what goes next in this little pop-out box. And after the lookup value, I need a comma. So I'll add a comma, and now I've got the first of the 4 things needed. The lookup value tells Excel what we are going to look up. Now we need the second thing, which Excel calls the table array. this is the data set we're searching. So remember, I'm in my roster tab or class list tab, and I want to go searching in the tab with my state test scores and find those scores, automatically bring them in, right? So I'm going to click on the other tab and click on the first column, second row, and I want to select my whole table. Now, I know I could click and drag the whole table, but there's a quicker way I like to do this. To do this, I hold Shift and Control down, and then I press the right arrow and press the down arrow. And in doing that, Excel automatically selects all of the data in my data set. So now I have my table selected. The next thing I need, according to my Excel help pop-out window, is a comma. So I'll type the comma. Now I have 2 of the 4 items needed for this formula. So if you look at the help bar, the third item for this formula is COL underscore index underscore NUM, and this stands for column index number. What this means is that Excel is going to go hunting for the student ID in this table we've just selected. And when it finds that ID, it needs to know which column in this data set to bring into my other spreadsheet. So in our case, we want column C, which is the third column over. So we need a 3 here to tell Excel when you find the student ID, I need the information in column 3. Next thing we need is another comma. And now we have 3 out of the 4 items that we need for our formula. The final thing for this formula is to tell Excel whether you want an exact match or an approximate match. I always want an exact match because I'm looking up specific student IDs. So I type false, or you can select the false in this drop-down menu for exact match. And then I end with a parentheses, just like putting punctuation at the end of a sentence, and I hit enter. Look at that. I now have a state test score of a 3 for this student. So if you want to check and say, did Excel do this right? We can go look it up ourselves and double check. This student is Alejandra Abrams. So let's go into our student test score. And there's several different ways we could look through this visually, but there's over 400 records. We could do a quick search, which is a Control F, type in the last name Abrams, hit find next, and there we go. This student did indeed get a 3. So we can be pretty confident that Excel did this right. I know that in this spreadsheet, I don't have any duplicate student IDs. I'm also familiar with this formula, so I have a high level of confidence. But if you wanted to do this and double check a few others, just to make sure you did things right, there's nothing wrong with QAing your own work, making sure your formula did actually work correctly. Now, one thing to remember, if you do this and your table has 2 students with the same unique ID, it will bring in the first score it finds, and that could be a problem. That's why names don't usually work and why having a unique student ID is best. I'd now like to copy this formula to the rest of my cells in this column, but there's one more thing I need to do. If you're not aware of how a $sign is used in Excel, this will be an important piece of information to catch. Look back up here at my formula. My second item for the VLOOKUP is the table array in which I want Excel to look for the student ID. It is A2 through D467. That's because if we look at my test score tab, I selected all the data in rows A through D, and there are 467 rows of data. If I copy this formula to my next row by grabbing the bottom lower corner and dragging it, Excel assumes a few things. It correctly changes the A2 to an A3 because now I'm on my next student and I do want it to search for the student ID in row 3. But look what it did to my table. It shifted it down a row. Now it's looking through A3 through D468. This will be a problem if I keep copying this formula because it will keep shifting the table. Watch what happens. So I need to tell Excel to hold the table static while it changes the lookup value. So let's go back to my formula. And in this formula, I'm going to insert a $sign before the column and the row indicators in my table. So now my formula will read $A, $2, colon, $D, $467, and I'll hit enter. Now watch what happens when I copy this formula. The lookup value changes with each row, as it should, but the table does not. So let's do a quick review, and then we'll bring the other column of data into the spreadsheet. The VLOOKUP has 4 distinct pieces. The first piece is the lookup value, which should be your unique variable, usually a student ID for educators. The second item is the table you are looking through. This is usually in another tab or can even be in another spreadsheet file. Use $signs once the formula is done to hold the table static. The third piece is the column number of the data you want Excel to bring into your datasheet. And finally, I always use false as the fourth piece to tell Excel I only want exact matches. Approximate matches might bring in the wrong student's data, so I never use true. So let's do this again and bring in the second state test score, which is called a scale score in this file. I'll label this next column scale score, and then type equals VLOOKUP and an open parentheses. Then I'll click on A2 because that's the unique student ID in this data sheet that I'm going to use to match to my other sheet. I need a comma after the first item, and then I'll go to my sheet with the data that I need to bring in and select my table. I'll use keyboard shortcuts like Control Shift right arrow and then down arrow for quick selecting. I need another comma to separate my second item from my third item, and then I have to count how many columns over is the data I want. In this case, it's the fourth column, so I'll type a 4 and then another comma and the word false and a close parentheses and hit enter. I need to add my $signs to my table and then I can double click on the bottom right corner of my cell with the formula and it will paste this into all the rows with data. And there you have it. I've now combined all my state test scores into my roster sheet without having to look up each student by hand. If I'm happy with this, I like to copy and paste values to get rid of the VLOOKUP formula. Reading the sheet of formulas helps condense the file size and speed up the performance of the data sheet. In a file like this, it probably doesn't make much of a difference, but for larger files with more complex formulas, the more you can use copy-paste value functions, the better Excel will perform. I hope these tips will increase your efficiency with Excel. VLOOKUP is often a game changer for people who use Excel, so I hope you find it useful. Check out my additional Excel for Educator videos for more help on using Excel. And until next time, this is Alicia Parker with Excel for Educators.